Okay, we finally get to do some real actual ecology work today as we are starting the biomes unit here in class. So it's good to do some science finally. So let's get this going. Biomes. So what is a biome? Well, it's basically an area that shares similar features such as climate, topography, meaning landforms, and soil conditions and life forms. So basically, a biome is something, an area in the world or an area on Earth that shares similar features. And the basic thing with a biome is they must share similar temperature and precipitation. So in other words, they must have the same either hot or cold temperatures or the amount of rain, sleet, hail, snow, whatever type of precipitation must be the same for it to be the same type of biome. So on this slide, up at the top here, this is a desert biome. Obviously very hot, also very dry. That biome does not have the same temperatures as the one, say, on the bottom here, which is the tundra, which is cold, actually has very little precipitation. So even though both of these have very little precipitation, they are not the same biome because their temperatures are vastly different, with the desert having mostly a very hot climate and the tundra down here on the bottom having mainly a cold climate. So temperature and the amount of precipitation an area gets will determine exactly what a biome is. First one is the desert. Many of you have heard of the desert, and you relate that to areas which have low precipitation. That is correct. These are areas which get very little rain. Another thing a lot of people don't know about deserts are that they're very hot during the day, as most of you know, but many people don't know they're actually very cold at night. And the reason for this is you don't have a lot of vegetation in the area to keep the moisture in and the heat in that start during the day, and so it escapes, it gets away. It's hard for rocks and sand and gravel to keep in hot temperatures, so at night all that heat escapes and there's nothing to hold it in, so deserts actually become very cold at night. So they have a wide range of temperatures. A lot of people think deserts are made of sand. That's actually not true. Most of them are made of gravel and rock. So most deserts look like the picture here at the top, made of a lot more gravel and larger rocks than sand. Obviously, there are sand deserts out there, but there aren't as many. Most deserts are gravel and rock. And the cool thing about deserts is a lot of the animals, because it's so dry and you don't get a lot of precipitation, they will adapt to their environments. So they will adapt different features, like you can see here with this lizard, has a lot of horns on its body and different growths. Those are to protect it from other animals. And it's developed these over time because there's just not a lot of cover for a smaller lizard. So since there isn't a lot of cover, a lot of vegetation, it's adapted these features over time to protect itself. The feature on the bottom is an ant, a desert ant, which has a very large, basically a stomach or a holder for moisture. Since there's very little moisture in a desert, animals have adapted ways to keep moisture in their bodies. You probably recognize a camel has a hump. Well, that hump is full of water. This ant is very similar to that in that it wants to keep moisture in its body. Since there's very little in the desert, it keeps moisture in that sac on its back end. Next one is a grassland. What's cool about grasslands is grasslands are the area around here in Missouri, Kansas, throughout the Midwest. These areas have grass and flowering plants, very few trees. So if you were to go back a couple hundred years, the state of Missouri or the area around Kansas City would look a lot like this. You have buffalo roaming, a lot of grass, small flowering plants, and very few trees. As you know, we have very distinct seasons here in the Kansas City area. We have a definite summer, fall, winter, and spring. Those are found in grasslands, and these are great areas for farming because the land is so fertile. Um, and so, a couple hundred years ago, this is what it looked like. You had a lot of animals that kind of roamed the plains, but today humans have taken those lands and made them into crops. So wheat, corn, and oats are grown quite frequently here in the Midwestern United States. So like I said, Midwestern United States, which is where we live, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, is a grassland. So once again, a couple hundred years ago, the land here looked a lot like this rather than today, which looks like the picture down on the bottom right. What's crazy is many of you maybe see deer or other animals, turkeys maybe, out roaming throughout Grandview, and that's natural. These areas used to contain vast herds of buffalo, which are these larger animals here, wolves and deer. But today, since we've taken over as humans, many of these areas do not have the animals like they used to. But again, if you were to go back a couple hundred years ago, you would see that these areas actually contain quite a few animals. Next one is a tundra. Tundra is usually a high mountainous area, as you can tell from the picture in the upper right-hand corner. It's usually a mountainous area. Very, very cold, harsh winters. Matter of fact, it's wintertime almost all year long in a tundra, so it is frozen for most of the year. And because of its very harsh conditions, a lot of cold, obviously, but also very little precipitation, you have very few life forms. Obviously, the polar bear lives in the tundra, and there's some other smaller plants. As you can see, the polar bear is in here, and some smaller animals. But there are very few life forms in the tundra because they migrate. They leave or they hibernate, go underground during much of the year. Because the conditions are so tough, it's very cold, it's very harsh, there's very little precipitation most of the time. It's a very difficult place to live. Most of the animals will leave the area or go into hibernation during much of the year. So a tundra, very high mountainous area, very cold, harsh winters, and animals, but not very many that will hibernate or migrate to other areas of the earth. Forests. A conifer forest is a low precipitation forest. Since it has low precipitation, you can see that the leaves in a coniferous forest or a conifer forest are one of two ways. They're either in a pine cone like this, or they're very thin and needle-like. And the reason why that happens is there's less moisture in the area, you have less rain, so therefore the leaves don't get as big, and they form more of a needle-like look. Fire is very important to these areas. Fires, you may or may not know, occur naturally. Most of the time they're started by lightning or sometimes just from the sun heating up an area. But fire is very important to a coniferous forest because it burns away all the dead stuff. As plants die and trees die, their parts fall to the ground, and those areas need cleaned up. So nature will do its best to burn those dead pieces. And the cool thing is, once a fire goes through a conifer forest, after the fire, there are nutrients left behind. So the picture down at the bottom right is a forest fire, and that's actually a good thing for forests when they are naturally set. Now, sometimes humans will unfortunately light forests on fire, and that's not a good thing. But when nature sets a fire to an area, it's actually a good thing because it adds nutrients back into the ground. So a conifer forest, low precipitation, very thin needle-like leaves, and also areas where forest fires are pretty prevalent. Deciduous forests. This is very similar to the coniferous forest, but the difference is you get a lot more precipitation, so a lot more rain. When this happens, you're going to have a lot more plants and trees simply because you have a lot more rain. And whenever you have more moisture, more water, you're going to have more vegetation. The trees in these areas produce bigger leaves, as you can tell from the picture in the upper right-hand corner. The leaves are much bigger. And after the season for growing of leaves is over, they shed their leaves. Very, very similar to what happens here in Missouri. We don't live in the middle of a deciduous forest, but the trees are very similar in that they shed the leaves. They turn colors in the fall, much like the picture in the upper right-hand corner, and they fall to the ground. And unfortunately, humans are starting to destroy these areas because we use the timber, the lumber, to build things in specific houses. And unfortunately, as you can see from the bottom, we're tearing apart the deciduous forests and creating large areas in which there is no more forest. Used to be a very big problem here in the United States. It's becoming less and less, but unfortunately in other countries, this harvesting is very damaging to the area, and it's really hurting the ecosystems in those areas. Next type of biome is called a scrub. Kind of a weird name, but it is kind of scrubby, I guess you could say. There are three types, the thorn, the Mediterranean, and the chaparral. The thorn is called the thorn because there are a lot of thorns there. Small spiny plants. It's dry all year round because the plants don't get much moisture, not much precipitation, develop spines, and they don't grow much. This is, if you can imagine, Africa. So Very few trees, small spiny plants. You have gazelle and rhinos and giraffes and all kinds of other animals running around in the thorn scrub. Mediterranean, you get a little bit more moisture, so you're going to see some smaller trees. Uh, it's a warm, dry climate, not as dry as a thorn, so you will get, like I said, some smaller trees and some flowers. Um, and fires are also very important in a Mediterranean scrub because just like with the coniferous forest that we talked about before, it burns away all the dead stuff and creates new nutrients for trees to grow back. And finally, the chaparral or chaparral, I've heard it two different ways, is another biome type of scrub that's found. It's dry. It gets more moisture than both the Mediterranean and the thorn. And what's cool about the chaparral scrubs are that you see a lot of unique species such as the jackrabbit, the kangaroo, some weird types of rats and lizards and birds. These are very unique areas um, which are mainly located for the most part in Australia and some other countries, but they're very well known for their unique species. So thorn, Mediterranean, and chaparral. Those are the three types of scrubs in the scrub biome. Two more biomes here. The tropical moist forests, as you can see, these areas are very hot and get lots of rain, and that's why you see plants with different colors. They're much larger. There's a wide variety of species in these areas because they get so much rain. Very abundant, complex life. So not only plants, but you get a lot of insects and also a lot of both smaller and bigger animals in these areas because there is more moisture in these areas. What's unique about tropical moist forests, there's literally millions of insect types. Some scientists believe there are actually more insects that have not been discovered than have been discovered in a tropical moist forest. They find new insects daily in the tropical moist forests. So there are millions of different insects in these forests, and that's because there's simply more precipitation and more moisture. Just like some of the forests we've talked about before, such as the deciduous forests, tropical moist forests are going through some real problems with what's called deforestation, and that's when you clear forests for the wood, for the harvest of the timber. As you can see in the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see big chunks of area that simply have been removed of the trees and the vegetation in those areas. The unfortunate thing with deforestation is this stuff takes literally decades to come back. So whenever humans destroy tropical moist forests, they're destroying not only the trees in the area but the entire ecosystem as well. So deforestation of tropical moist forest is a major, major problem, especially in countries in South America. And our last biome is the tropical seasonal forest. Very similar to the tropical moist forest, except in the tropical seasonal forest you have distinct wet and dry seasons. So for approximately half the year you'll get a lot of rain, a lot of moisture, your plants and trees will grow, and then you'll go through these long dry seasons in which there will be very little rain, and many of the things will die off or maybe shrink or just go dormant, but there are distinct seasons. In a tropical moist forest, you have basically precipitation all year long. It never stops. But in a tropical seasonal forest, you have very distinct wet and then very dry seasons. So there's definitely seasons in a tropical seasonal forest, hence the name seasonal. The temperatures are very hot year-round, so even though you have distinct wet and dry seasons, the temperatures stay hot all year round. So you'll have a hot wet season and then a hot dry season, but you'll have those distinct differences in precipitation in those areas. You have a lot of grassy areas, and the trees do grow big, but they have to be what's called drought resistant. And the reason why they're resistant is they have to get used to long seasons with no water. So the trees will grow during the wet season, and they will go dormant or simply resist the drought during the dry seasons. And trees have been accustomed to this over the years, getting used to both the wet and the dry season. And what's very unique about tropical seasonal forests is this is where much of the world's population lives. Africa, Asia, and Australia are made of mostly but not entirely tropical seasonal forest areas, and this is where most of the people worldwide live because Africa, Asia, and Australia are large continents which have a lot of people. Unfortunately, there are areas in a tropical seasonal forest, where as you can see in the picture in the bottom, we have problems with deforestation, and there are actually areas where human beings have wiped out about 99% of the forest in some areas. And like I said before, with the tropical moist forests and the coniferous forests and the deciduous forests, when you wipe out an area such as the one in the bottom picture here, it takes decades, if not a century, to grow back. So whenever we wipe out these trees to build things or to um, use the wood for human uses, many times we not only obviously kill the trees in that area, but we also kill the ecosystem entirely in that area as well. So that's biomes. Good luck.